Mr. Henderson, and then County Attorney. Yes? Mrs. Hale, looking about. It never seemed a very cheerful place. County Attorney. No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct. Mrs. Hale. Well, I don't know his right head either. County Attorney. You mean that they didn't get on very well? Mrs. Hale. No, I don't mean anything, but I don't think a place'd be any cheerfuller for John Wright's being in it. County Attorney. I'd like to talk more of that a little later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs now. He goes to the left, where 3 steps lead to a stair door. Sheriff. I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does'll be all right. She was to take in some clothes for her, you know, and a few little things. We left in such a hurry yesterday. County Attorney. Yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us. Mrs. Peters. Yes, Mr. Henderson. The women listen to the men's steps on the stairs, then look about the kitchen. Mrs. Hale. I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing. She arranges the pans under sink, which the lawyer had shoved out of place. Mrs. Peters. Of course it's no more than their duty. Mrs. Hale. Duty's all right, but I guess that deputy sheriff that came out to make the fire might have got a little of this on. Gives the roller towel a pull. Wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having things slicked up when she had to come away in such a hurry. Mrs. Peters, who has gone to a small table in the left rear corner of the room and lifted one end of a towel that covers a pan. She had bread set. Stands still. Mrs. Hale, eyes fixed on a loaf of bread beside the bread box, which is on a low shelf at the other side of the room, moves slowly toward it. She was going to put this in there. Picks up loaf, then abruptly drops it, in a manner of returning to familiar things. It's a shame about her fruit. I wonder if it's all gone. Gets up on the chair and looks. I think there's some here that's all right, Mrs. Peters. Yes, here, holding it toward the window. This is cherries, too. Looking again. I declare I believe that's the only one. Gets down, bottle in her hand. Goes to the sink and wipes it off on the outside. She'll feel awful bad after all her hard work in the hot weather. I remember the afternoon I put my cherries last summer. She puts the bottle on the big kitchen table, center of the room. With a sigh, is about to sit down in the rocking chair. Before she is seated, realizes what chair it is. With a slow look at it, steps back. The chair which she has touched rocks back and forth. Mrs. Peters. Well, I must get those things from the front closet. She goes to the door at the right, but after looking into the other room, steps back. You coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry them. They go into the other room. Reappear, Mrs. Peters carrying a dress and skirt, Mrs. Hale following with a pair of shoes. Mrs. Peters. My, it's cold in there. She puts the clothes on the big table and hurries to the stove. Mrs. Hale, examining the skirt. Wright was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part, and then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was to take in? Mrs. Peters. She said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want, for there isn't much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. But I suppose just to make her feel more natural. She said they was in the top drawer in this cupboard. Yes, here. And then her little shawl that always hung behind the door. Opens stair door and looks. Yes, here it is. Quickly shuts door leading upstairs. Mrs. Hale, abruptly moving toward her. Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters. Yes, Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale. Do you think she did it? Mrs. Peters, in a frightened voice. Oh, I don't know. Mrs. Hale. Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron in her little shawl? Worrying about her fruit? Mrs. Peters starts to speak, glances up, where footsteps are heard in the room above, in a low voice. Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in a speech, and he'll make fun of her saying she didn't wake up. Mrs. Hale. Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake when they was slipping that rope under his neck. Mrs. Peters. No, it's strange. It must have been done awful crafty and still. They say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that. Mrs. Hale. That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand. Mrs. Peters. Mr. Henderson said coming out that what was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling. Mrs. Hale, who was standing by the table. Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here. She puts her hand on the dish towel which lies on the table, stands looking down at table, one half of which is clean, the other half messy. It's wiped up to here. Makes a move as if to finish work, then turns and looks at loaf of bread outside the bread box. Drops towel. In that voice of coming back to familiar things. Wonder how they are finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more read up there. You know, it seems kind of sneaking, locking her up in town and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her. Mrs. Peters. But Mrs. Hale, the law is the law. Mrs. Hale. I suppose 'tis. Unbuttoning her coat. Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out. Mrs. Peters takes off her fur tippet, goes to hang it on hook at back of room, stands looking at the under part of the small corner table. Mrs. Peters. She was piecing a quilt. She brings the large sewing basket and they look at the bright pieces. Mrs. Hale. It's a log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it? I wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it. Footsteps have been heard coming down the stairs. The sheriff enters, followed by Hale and the county attorney. Sheriff. They wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it. The men laugh. The women look abashed. County attorney, rubbing his hands over the stove. Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Well, let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up. The men go outside. Mrs. Hale, resentfully. I don't know as there's anything so strange our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. She sits down at the big table, smoothing out a block with decision. I don't see as it's anything to laugh about. Mrs. Peters, apologetically. Of course they've got awful important things on their minds. Pulls up a chair and joins Mrs. Hale at the table. Mrs. Hale, examining another block. Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Here, this is the one she was working on. And look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even. And look at this. It's all over the place. Why, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about. After she has said this, they look at each other, then start to glance back at the door. After an instant, Mrs. Hale has pulled at a knot and ripped the sewing. Mrs. Peters. Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale? Mrs. Hale, mildly. Just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good. Threading a needle. Bad sewing always makes me fidgety. Mrs. Peters, nervously. I don't think we ought to touch things. Mrs. Hale. I'll just finish up this end. Suddenly stopping and leaning forward. Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Peters. Yes, Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale. What do you suppose she was so nervous about? Mrs. Peters. Oh, I don't know. I don't know if she was nervous. I sometimes sew awful queer when I'm just tired. Mrs. Hale starts to say something, looks at Mrs. Peters, then goes on sewing. Well, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be through sooner than we think. Putting apron and other things together. I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and string. Mrs. Hale. In that cupboard, maybe. Mrs. Peters, looking in cupboard. Why, here's a bird cage. Holds it up. Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale? Mrs. Hale. Why, I don't know whether she did or not. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know as she took one. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself. Mrs. Peters, glancing around. Seems funny to think of a bird here. But she must have had one, or why would she have a cage? I wonder what happened to it. Mrs. Hale. I suppose maybe the cat got it. Mrs. Peters. No, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. My cat got in her room, and she was real upset and asked me to take it out. Mrs. Hale. My sister Bessie was like that. Queer, ain't it? Mrs. Peters, examining the cage. Why, look at this door. It's broke. One hinge is pulled apart. Mrs. Hale, looking too. Looks as if someone must have been rough with it. Mrs. Peters. Why, yes. She brings the cage forward and puts it on the table. Mrs. Hale.